The ceremony continued until just before dawn. Illuminated by a central fire, the celebrants moved together in ancient rhythms, their clam shell necklaces clicking in soft harmony, the women in their heavy regalia supported by male dancers on either side. Meanwhile, singers raised their voices heavenward in the songs of Nidash, or the feather dance. Between songs, they offered prayers of thanks, not only for the creation of the world, but for its renewal. Finally, the celebrants stopped and walked away together under a full moon. They made their way through small round doorways into redwood plank houses with peaked roofs. Inside, Tolowa people lay down next to kith and kin. The celebrants were unaware that local men in Crescent City, just 7 miles away, were readying California's newest branch of its ever-expanding killing machine. Crescent City's Coast Rangers and Klamath Mounted Rangers had been well armed by the state's governor, Bigler. In January of 1854, California's state quartermaster general had sent the Klamath County judge 20 muskets, 10 rifles, and 10,000 rifle cartridges. By November, the Coast Rangers had 35 rifles, 3,000 rounds of ammunition, and 4 swords. The Klamath Rangers, meanwhile, received an additional 50 arsenals sent in a crate from the state arsenal in Sacramento. These heavily armed state militiamen, armed with weapons provided by the state, prepared to do one thing and one thing only: kill Indian people. In the pre-dawn hours of the last day of 1854, as many as 116 state militiamen and an unknown number of auxiliaries quietly surrounded the village and took up positions in the brush. At daybreak, as men, women, and children emerged to begin the day, the militiamen and vigilantes opened fire on them, shooting down men, women, children, and elders. The records tell us from the perpetrators that they shot them down just as fast as they could reload their weapons. Possessing only 3 guns, the Tolowa and their guests were unable to protect themselves. A few plunged into the waters of nearby Lake Earl. There, too, they became targets, shot down as they swam across the lake by sharpshooters already positioned on its opposite bank. When the shooting stopped, perhaps 500 people were dead. Not more than 5 seem to have survived. The attackers suffered a single casualty. And the state of California later paid these militiamen for their work. Now, between 1846, which is on the far left side of this graph, and 1870, toward the right side, you can see that California's Indian population suffered a cataclysmic decline from approximately 150,000 people to not more than 30,000 people. And by 1880, census takers recorded fewer than 17,000 California Indian people alive. When I began this research, it was clear to me that diseases, dislocation, starvation, and exposure were major causes of these deaths. But as I began to study the archives, it became clear to me that something more sinister was also involved. This was a case of genocide. What is genocide? In the year 1948, the United Nations General Assembly unanimously passed a law with this text at its heart. There are 2 things that a prosecutor must prove in order to convict an individual of genocide. The first thing that they must do is they must prove intent. Intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. Motive doesn't figure in. It doesn't matter if the motive is stealing land or making money or getting access to a material good. It's the intent to destroy the group that matters. But the second thing that the prosecutor must prove is that the defendant has committed one of the 5 genocidal acts that you see listed here. This is law that is being used right now, even as we are meeting here, at the International Criminal Court at The Hague to try some Serbian defendants for the crime of genocide, and also right now in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, in the extraordinary courts of the Chambers of Cambodia to try former Khmer Rouge members for the crime of genocide. And to date, over 60 people, mostly citizens of Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, have been convicted of the crime of genocide and are now serving prison terms for that crime. Following the formulation of this new international legal treaty, scholars began re-examining the conquest and colonization of California by the United States. And by the year 2000, more than 20 different scholars had deemed what happened in California under US rule to in fact be a case of genocide. Building on this previous scholarship, the book that I have just come out with, An American Genocide, is the first comprehensive year-by-year accounting of the genocide that took place in California, with a specific emphasis upon the role of the state of California and the federal government. This topic, as you might begin to be thinking about, has a lot at stake. A lot at stake for all of us, not only for scholars, but for indigenous Californians and all Americans. If US citizens founded some regions of California, if not the state as a whole, on deliberate attempts to annihilate California Indian people, scholars will need to reevaluate some of the current axioms, not only of California history, but also of the history of the United States. Scholars could, for example, revisit the assumption that is prevalent assumption, not only for California, but for the whole nation, that it was the indirect causes of colonization, things like disease, dislocation, and exposure, and not direct violence, like murder and mass killings, that caused the precipitous depopulation of American Indian people in this country. Exceptionalist interpretations of US history, which I'm sure that you've heard in your high school textbooks, which suggest that US history is somehow unique and different from the histories of all other countries, may come under increasing scrutiny as people, like myself, begin to compare the genocide that happened in California to other genocides in colonial settings, for example, in colonial Australia. A careful study of genocide in particular places helps scholars to examine larger questions. And here, the larger question that I am particularly attuned to answering is the question of what caused the massive population catastrophe that swept through the Americas from Patagonia all the way north to the Arctic Sea. Another question that scholars have to evaluate when they find a set of genocide is whether or not this was an exceptional event or part of a recurring local, regional, or national pattern. Larger questions then begin to follow. What tended to catalyze genocide? Who ordered the killing? Who carried it out? And perhaps most importantly, why do we not know more about these events? But you also have to wonder, especially after you hear this story that I'm about to tell you, whether or not democracy played a leading role in driving mass murder. And ultimately, what role did genocide play in the making of modern Canada, Mexico, the United States, and other Western Hemisphere nations? Given its political, economic, psychological, and health ramifications, the question of genocide in the state of California is particularly urgent for the state's 150,000 California Indian people. As I've worked on this project, I've visited over a dozen California Indian communities, many of them as many as a dozen times, and a lot of really important questions have come up. How, for example, does a California Indian individual who is descended both from perpetrators and victims reconcile themselves to this history. California Indian leaders are beginning to grapple with the questions of whether or not they should press for government apologies, reparations, or control of land where these events took place. How should these events be commemorated at the same time that modern California Indian communities are emphasizing accommodation, cultural renaissance, resistance, and survival? The psychological issues are fraught. How to reconcile increased knowledge of genocide, sometimes at the hands of the United States, with an often intense patriotism. Finally, what role might acknowledgement of genocides or their understanding have in dealing with intergenerational historical trauma? Those situations that are so prevalent in California Indian communities today, and that trauma's direct connection to present-day physical illnesses, substance abuse, domestic violence, and the extraordinarily high rates of suicide now seen among California Indian youth. The question of genocide in California under US rule also poses explosive questions for all of us, both native and non-native. Should government officials tender public apologies, as Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush did for the forcible relocation and internment of 82,000 Japanese Americans during the Second World War? And reparations are closely linked to that question. Will Congress advocate paying reparations to California Indians along the lines of the more than $1.6 billion that has to date now been paid to Japanese Americans who were forcibly interned and to their heirs? Might California officials decrease their cut of California Indian gaming, revenues that topped $7.3 billion in 2014, as one way of paying reparations for the state's direct involvement in genocide? A better understanding of the California genocide might also impact the United States federal government's dealings with the more than 70 California Indian communities that are currently seeking formal federal recognition as American Indian nations. The commemoration question is closely linked. Will non-Indians tolerate or support the public commemoration of mass murders committed by some of the state's forefathers with the same kinds of monuments, museums, or state-legislated days of remembrance that today commemorate, for example, the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust? Will genocides against California Indian people join these canonical mass murders in public school curricula or public discourse? These questions are important, but can only be addressed in very limited ways without a thorough understanding of relations between natives and newcomers in California during the beginning of statehood. Sporadic mass killings of California Indian people punctuated the original years of US rule in California. But it was James Marshall's 1848 gold strike that precipitated mass migration to the state. And some of the first people to come in large numbers to California in search of gold were immigrants from Oregon. Immigrants from Oregon who had recently been defeated in the so-called Cayuse Wars. Immigrants who came to California and routinely shot on sight every California Indian person that they saw. Now, these newcomers had little or no experience with Russo-Hispanic California, societies in which indigenous peoples played crucial economic and social roles. These Oregonians instead saw the indigenous people of California primarily as obstacles standing in the way of the acquisition of wealth. In 1849, Oregonian attacks on California Indians increased in both frequency and in lethality, particularly in the Nishanan and northern Miwok lands where the central mines were booming. That would be in this area pictured here. One 49er explained what was going on, and I'll quote, "Oregon people were well used to shooting Indians and they did shoot them down freely. That April, Theodore Johnson entered the epicenter of this rapidly expanding local genocide, Sutter's Mill, where James Marshall had famously found gold. In the central mines, Johnson and other eyewitnesses reported multiple massacres, scalpings, beheadings, and the slaying of surrendered California Indian people. Now, due to spotty primary source coverage, we will probably never know exactly how many Native people were killed in 1848 and 1849 in the central mines. But it seems possible to me that hundreds, if not thousands, were killed there during these times. What was absolutely clear to contemporary observers was the exterminatory nature of these killings, both in their design, that is in their intent, and in their impact. Now, the slaying of two white ranchers near Clear Lake, about 150 miles north of San Francisco in December 1849, now marked a crucial turning point toward a larger statewide genocide. In response to this double homicide, vigilantes and United States Army soldiers killed over 1,000 California Indian people between December of 1849 and May of 1850s. Vigilantes first murdered and massacred large numbers in Napa and Sonoma counties, the areas that are now famous for their fancy restaurants, their expensive wineries, etc. Then, after the arrest of some of these vigilantes, California's Supreme Court let them go in its very first case ever. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army also sought to avenge the deaths of these two white ranchers. In an article titled "Horrible Slaughter of Indians," one newspaper in San Francisco described a massacre committed by United States Army forces at Clear Lake, using information provided directly by a U.S. Army captain. And I quote, "They poured in a destructive fire indiscriminately upon them, men, women, and children. They fell as grass before the sweep of the scythe. Little or no resistance was encountered, and the work of butchery was of but short duration. Neither sex nor age was spared. It was the order of extermination, fearfully obeyed. Hundreds seem to have died in this atrocity, 800 individuals by one account. Other killings followed, and the officers involved were not censured. They were, in fact, promoted. A new factor was now at work: large-scale, extended vigilante and United States Army operations tolerated by both state and federal officials. As the California gold rush continued, immigrants surged into the state in ever-increasing numbers. Before the gold rush, there were perhaps 13 or 14,000 non-Indians living in the state of California, representing well less than 10% of the total population. But as you can see from this graph, by 1860, there were well over 360,000 non-Indian people living in the state. Now, they came to California primarily in search of wealth. They wanted to find that shiny yellow stuff laying in creek beds. But as they sought to feed themselves, clothe themselves, find sexual partners, they generated shockwaves that had a devastating impact upon California Indian communities. California's new leaders now magnified that impact. During the period of martial law from 1848 to 1850, United States military officers made California Indian people into second-class subjects with few or no rights. In fact, by the end of the period of military rule, California Indian people had to carry a pass. This was a pass system, not unlike that used in the Deep South for the control of African-American chattel slaves. So if you didn't have the pass, you could be shot on sight or immediately arrested and put to work on the public works or sold off as an unfree laborer in a public auction. And abduction, in fact, played a major role in the California Indian catastrophe. In 1850, legislators convened for the first time, elected state legislators, and one of their first acts was to legalize the white custody of Indian minors and Indian prisoner leasing, while also allowing courts to summarily reject the testimony of California Indians. And what this facilitated was forcing Indian people into unfree work on trumped-up charges. And in case you can't see this here, this is a document that I found in the Bancroft Library. This is an ad for a 16-year-old California Indian female at the price of a pound of gunpowder and a bottle of brandy. So this is a slave sale bill that would have been publicly posted. In the year 1860, legislators in the state expanded that law to legalize the indenture of any Indian, whether prisoner, male, female, and without anything to do with parents or guardians. In combination, the 1850 law and the 1860 law triggered a boom in Indian slave raiding. Now, these slave raids were often violent. They often involved massacres. They often involved the killing of all adult men. But they also separated men and women during peak reproductive years. So both the act of capturing people was destructive, and the separation of men and women was destructive. In addition, there was a third highly destructive demographic factor, and that was that people who owned California Indian unfree laborers found them to be so cheap and easy to replace that they often treated them as entirely disposable. From the city where I now live, I'll read you the recollection of one of the city's top lawyers. And I quote, "Los Angeles had its slave market, and thousands of useful, honest Southern California Indian people were absolutely destroyed in this way." Now, when Horace Bell says absolutely destroyed, he means absolutely destroyed. Between the years 1850 and 1870, the Los Angeles Indian population fell from 3,619 to just 219. Escape was one of the primary ways in which California's indigenous peoples defied servitude. But owners often responded with lethal force. For example, the Lasik Wailaki woman Lucy Young, who, oops, wrong slide. There we go. Here's Lucy Young. She escaped servitude multiple times. One time she actually was chained to her owner's cast iron stove, and she chopped through the chains with a hatchet to free herself and run away. And she recollected something powerful I want to read to you at length here. This is what Lucy said. "Young woman been stole by white, come back, shot through lights and liver. Front skin hang down like apron. She tie up with cotton dress, never died either." Others were less fortunate. After one California Indian woman fled her, quote, lord and master with his Indian boy in 1858, whites responded by massacring her and her entire village of 13 individuals. 2 years later, a rancher became so incensed when his 7-year-old Indian servant went half a mile away to visit his family. They killed not only the boy, but everybody in the entire village. Now, despite such reports, policymakers at both the state and the federal levels failed to intervene, while almost all law enforcement officials turned a blind eye. The United States Congress, meanwhile, made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to immigration's blast. Between the years 1851 and 1852, U.S. treaty agents, these three men who are pictured here in this photograph, made 18 separate treaties with California Indian communities, setting aside approximately 1/7 of the entire state to be reservation lands. But the white population of California turned against these treaties and convinced their own Senate and congressional delegations to lobby hard in Washington, D.C. against their ratification. What happened was that the Senate failed to ratify these treaties. And you can see here on this map, these gray areas are the areas that were supposed to have been set aside as reservation lands for California's First Peoples. Instead, U.S. senators created 5 military reservations not to exceed 25,000 acres each, and conferred no legal jurisdiction or land titles on California's Indian people. The results were fourfold, and they're quite important. Let me just work through them for you quickly because they set the legal stage. First, no reservations were patented, and jurisdiction over reservation lands was left highly uncertain. Second, California's Indian people did not become explicit wards of the federal government, as they were in other parts of the United States. Third, because jurisdiction remained so uncertain, conflicts between and among state and federal and local authorities for who had actual control of these reservations persisted for decades. Finally, United States Army Major General John Wool's 1857 interpretation of the reservation's legal status denied them full U.S. Army protection, and I quote from General Will, "Until these reservations are perfected, United States troops have no right to exclude whites from either entering or occupying these reserves, or even to prevent them from stealing women and children." Federal officials thus made California Indians particularly vulnerable to kidnapping, slavery, assault, and mass murder. The establishment of the state of California's militia system now marked the advent of a formalized killing machine. Between the years 1850 and 1864, 3,414 volunteer state militiamen participated in 24 separate Indian hunting operations. These operations killed at least 1,342 California Indian people. But their impact and their participation in the genocide transcended these numbers. Militiamen served as a widely publicized state endorsement of Indian killing, communicating an unofficial grant of legal impunity to vigilantes. And vigilantes, in fact, killed more than 6,400 California Indian people during this period. Now, lest you think that these 24 operations by state militiamen were somehow rogue, they were in fact directly and explicitly supported by both the governor and legislature of the state of California. In January 1851, California's first elected civilian governor, a man named Peter Burnett, declared, and I quote, "that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct." Soon thereafter, state legislators put the power of the purse behind genocidal anti-Indian militia campaigns. In February of that year, state legislators voted to borrow $500,000, an extraordinarily large amount of money at this time, to fund both past and future anti-Indian state militia operations. Meanwhile, the state began building up a substantial arsenal of arms donated to them by the United States Army. Then in May of 1852, following a spate of lethal anti-Indian state militia operations, the state passed a $600,000 bond measure to support additional operations. This is actually a picture of one of those bonds. It would have had coupons hanging off here, and in each period, the bond owner would bring in the bond, the coupon would be detached and they would be paid their 7% interest payment on the bond. So these were quite a lucrative investment. This particular one is in a denomination of $250, but there were smaller bonds such that these were purchased both by individual investors and by institutional investors like banks and life insurance companies. You see this here? Anybody see who that is? It's George Washington. For some California Indian leaders, the pattern of exterminatory acts was becoming clear. After atrocities by militiamen in the year 1854, a Modoc leader announced at a tribal council meeting, and I quote, "We have lived here in peace, but we cannot get along with these new white people. They come and they kill our people for nothing. Not only men, but women and children too." He concluded, "They will hunt us down even more than we hunt the deer and the antelope." The Sikion woman Sally Bell provided a rare California Indian eyewitness account of a massacre that took place in her homeland sometime in the mid-1850s. Bell remembered, and I quote, "About 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather and my mother and my father. I saw them do it. Then they killed my baby sister. They cut her heart out. They threw it into the brush where I ran and hid. My little sister was a baby, just crawling around. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared, I guess I just hid there for a long time. My baby sister's heart in my hands. It was a terrifying time to be a California Indian person." Sadly, the United States government now endorsed such killing. In the year 1854, the United States Congress allocated over $924,000 to reimburse California for past and future state militia operations. Predictably, a new surge of militia and vigilante killings followed, even as state leaders moved to perfect the killing machine. This man pictured here, State Quartermaster and Adjutant General William Kibbe, spent the time to write down a book of tactics. And these tactical manuals were distributed to his state militia officers, making them ever more efficient killers. That same year, Jefferson Davis, he was then the Secretary of War, this is before he became the leader of the Confederacy, he also sent 34 books, manuals of tactics to be distributed to militia officers. Then in 1857, state legislators appropriated an additional $410,000 for state militia operations with predictable results. Finally, in the year 1861, Congress appropriated another $400,000 to pay the extensive expenses of 9 militia expeditions that had killed at least 766 people. U.S. congressmen thus indirectly sanctioned mass murder after the fact. Although California Indians often resisted, civilians and officials carried out large forced removal operations in the late 1850s to concentrate California Indian people on federal reservations. For example, in the year 1856, vigilantes massacred 55 people in the process of taking one community to the Mendocino Reservation. The Lake Yakuts woman Yoimut recollected that during the forced removal of her community to the Central California Valley's Fresno Reservation, soldiers killed a dozen Indians. Likewise, the Nomlaki man Andrew Freeman explained that, and I quote, "When they took us Indians over to Round Valley reservations, they drove us like stock, and they shot down the old people who could not make the trip. They would shoot little children just for stopping by the side and being tired." Once they arrived at reservations, California Indian people often encountered lethal institutionalized starvation. The Concow leader, Tome Yamnam, recollected that after volunteers had forcibly removed his people to the Mendocino Reservation, "We were very hungry and my conch cows began to die very fast. Other reservations proved little better. In about 1860, Tomoyanem and his people relocated south from the Mendocino Reservation down to the Round Valley Reservation, where he explained there is even less to eat. Indeed, in 1860, federal officials at the Round Valley Reservation provided just 480 to 910 calories per day to each working Indian. By 1862, daily rations there fell to between 160 and 390 calories per day. Further diminishing these already inadequate rations, those who did not work were infrequently fed, if at all. The reservation, by the way, possessed hundreds of cattle, over 750 head of cattle at that point. But the official policy was that, and I quote, Indians are to be allowed no meat. If some California reservation inmates died of institutionalized starvation, malnutrition predictably weakened the immune systems of others, making them highly susceptible to lethal diseases. Starvation and malnutrition also predictably depressed fecundity while increasing both stillbirths and miscarriages. Some reservation officials and colonists also used California Indians as unpaid laborers with lethal results. I'll give you one example. According to a colonist, about 300 died on Round Valley Reservation during the winter of 1856 to 1857 from the effects of packing them through the mountains in the snow or mud. Each carried 55 pounds if able, and very few had any clothes. At California reservations, willful neglect killed an untold number of people. Federal officials also killed California Indians in far more direct ways. During the U.S. Civil War, 15,725 white California men joined the Union Army, but very few of them ever left the state of California. Most remained, and they transformed the state's killing machine. As U.S. troops, these so-called California volunteers had no limitation on their time of service. They had endless supplies of food, horses, uniforms, and perhaps most importantly, weapons and bullets. Short-term militia campaigns now became relentless, long-term U.S. Army campaigns, often staffed by the very same men. The U.S. Army now fielded the most sustained operations yet seen in California. The U.S. Army killed substantial numbers. In their very first campaign at the beginning of 1862, in a few weeks, California volunteers hunted down 120 people on the state's northwest coast. But hundreds more would die in similar operations, directed by men like this man, West Point-trained Colonel Henry M. Black. California volunteers also killed prisoners en masse on multiple occasions. U.S. Cavalry Captain Moses McLaughlin proudly reported how, in the fall of 1863, quote, I had all the bucks collected together and 35 either shot or sabred to death. None escaped, end quote. McLaughlin concluded his official report to his commanding general with a statement of genocidal intent, and I quote, they will all soon be either killed off or pushed so far into the surrounding desert wastes that they would die of absolute hunger and thirst there. The U.S. Army continued killing California Indian people through the 1860s and only concluded their last major anti-Indian hunting operation with the 1872-1873 Modoc War. The California Indian catastrophe fits that two-part legal definition of genocide that I presented to you quite earlier. First, perpetrators documented in both word and in deed their intent to destroy. Second, they committed examples of not one, but all 5 of the genocidal crimes enumerated by the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. Killing occurred in more than 370 separate massacres, as well as hundreds of smaller killings, homicides, and executions. Sources indicate that from the year 1846 to the year 1873, vigilantes, militiamen, and regular soldiers killed at least 9,492 to 16,094 California Indian people, and probably many, many more. By way of contrast, sources indicate that California Indian people killed fewer than 1,500 non-Indians during this entire period. Other acts of genocide proliferated too. Many rapes and beatings were recorded, and these meet the convention's definition of causing serious bodily harm to victims on the basis of their group identity and with the intent to physically destroy them. The sustained military and civilian policy of demolishing California Indian villages as well as their food stores, and then pushing survivors into inhospitable alpine regions amounted to deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Some Office of Indian Affairs employees administering federal Indian reservations in California committed the same genocidal crime. In fact, the famous UC Berkeley demographer Sherburne Cook called them concentration camps as early as 1943. Further, because malnutrition and exposure predictably lowered birth rates while increasing the number of stillbirths and miscarriages, some state and federal decision makers appear guilty of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Finally, the state of California, slave raiders, and federal officials were all very much involved in forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In fact, scholars estimate that 3,000 to 4,000 or more California Indian children were subject to such forced removals. By breaking up families and whole communities, forced removals also constituted imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. In effect, the state legalized abduction and enslavement of Indian minors. Slavers exploited these explicit indenture laws. Federal officials prevented the United States Army from intervening to protect the victims. And in some cases, slavers actually followed in the wake of U.S. Army campaigns to capture people for servitude. Sufficient evidence then exists to designate the California Indian catastrophe a genocide, according to the UN Genocide Convention. So who exactly was responsible? Well, elected California officials were the primary architects of annihilation. They created the laws, they raised the money, and they raised the forces that went out and did much of the killing. But the U.S. Army also played a crucial role in California's catastrophe. First, creating an exclusionary legal system, then setting genocidal precedents, and finally taking over much of the killing. In total, United States Army forces killed at least 1,688 to 3,741 California Indian people. If state legislators were the main architects of genocide, though, federal officials laid the groundwork, became the final arbiters of the design, and ultimately paid for most of its official execution. Indeed, they allocated up to $1,324,000 to pay for these killing campaigns by state militiamen, to say nothing of the huge expenditures that they made on other operations like the Modoc. Now, like California Indian people, Native Americans across the United States suffered devastating population declines following the arrival of newcomers. Before contact, at least 5 million or more indigenous people populated the continental United States, but that number fell to approximately 250,000 by the turn of the 20th century. What caused this catastrophe? Scholars tell us that disease was the leading cause. But after completing this project, I began to wonder, was something as sinister as what happened in California also to blame elsewhere? Now, academics have long debated whether or not Native Americans, or at least some specific groups of Native Americans, suffered genocide during the conquest and colonization of the Americas. The question of genocide here in the United States remains an important subject. Why? Because the near obliteration of this country's indigenous peoples is one of the formative events in this country's history. As in many other Western Hemisphere states, the Native American population cataclysm in the United States played an absolutely foundational role in facilitating the conquest and colonization of literally millions of square miles, the real estate and the vast cornucopia of natural resources upon which the modern United States was built. So how we explain the Native American population cataclysm in this country directly informs how we understand the nation in which we live. Beyond interpretations of US history, the stakes are high, much as they are in California. They're the same kinds of things. Public acknowledgement, apology, reparations, control of and access to natural resources, land, Native American political sovereignty, and ultimately, national character. There are two factors that have polarized the debate in the United States about the question of genocide. The first is that only some participants agree to use the UN Genocide Convention as their definition, even though 147 countries have signed or are party to it, and a growing law of case body supports it. Just as important, many participants emphasize rendering a verdict of genocide or not genocide, not only for the history of the United States, but for the history of the entire Americas, from Patagonia to the Arctic, and from 1492 right up to the present moment in which we're sitting here together in this room. Across the United States, though, Native American population declines took place at different rates and in very different ways. They took place over millions of square miles and over centuries of time. Colonial, state, and federal policy-making personnel changed, as did their government's policies. Moreover, hundreds of sovereign Native American nations were involved. Their resistance and accommodation strategies varied and changed. And thus, despite the many, many histories that we have on our library's bookshelves of violence against Native American people, the details, I think, still remain to be closely analyzed with regard to the question of genocide. Assessing the question of genocide in the history of the United States, or in the history of the Americas as a whole, without an agreed-upon definition and without detailed, robust case studies, makes it very difficult to reach comprehensive conclusions. The direct and deliberate killing of California Indians between 1846 and 1873 was more lethal and sustained than anywhere else in the United States or in its colonial antecedents. But there remains a need for additional case studies addressing other regions and other indigenous peoples both within and beyond the United States. The variables present in California were not the same variables present everywhere else. In other cases, disease was a larger factor. Both state and federal or colonial and metropolitan decision makers did not collude to the same degree in every case. Other Indian peoples replied with very different resistance strategies. For example, entirely fleeing contact zones or killing and driving away large numbers of colonizers. Finally, in other cases, colonizers may have committed few or no genocidal crimes, while the rates and causes of death may have differed quite substantially. My suggestion here today is an invitation to work with me with your own projects. We need to build on our existing knowledge with new research, maybe your research, to better understand one of the formative events in the history of the United States and the history of Native America, ultimately the history of the Western Hemisphere. My hope is that this book presents a workable methodology for how these kinds of studies may be addressed, both within the United States, throughout the Americas, and beyond. The UN Genocide Convention provides us as scholars with a standardized, internationally recognized rubric and a coherent legal definition that may be consistently applied. This book suggests that scholars rigorously consider each and every potential case in consistent terms. Just as important, we should consider each on a case-by-case and region-by-region basis, not just in California, but nationally and internationally, in order to create a precision in our use of a politically explosive term. And to seriously consider the balance between variables like epidemic disease and the 5 categories of genocidal crimes enumerated in the UN Genocide Convention. Detailed case studies are an important element of genocide studies, a field that I should point out is often riven by intense definitional debates. Because case studies provide a very powerful tool, not only with which to understand genocide, but to prevent its recurrence in the future. Native American peoples experienced and reacted to conquest and colonization in a wide variety of ways, rigorously examining this varied range of responses, using the Genocide Convention to evaluate both genocidal intent and genocidal acts, will help to move the discussion of genocide in the United States toward clarity. Unbraiding each people's history from the tapestry of Native American experience and bringing each people's history into sharper relief will create a clearer, more vivid portrait of Native American experiences and of United States history as a whole. Such investigations will be painful, but they will help all of us, both Native and non-Native, to make more accurate sense of our past and ourselves. Thank you.
Well, this was a very, heavy topic, but at the same time, I think it's a very relevant topic for and a topic that is not addressed often, and I think because of that, it's harsh, right? It's a harsh history. But we have a time for Q&A, but I have a question, okay? And so this is, as you do this type of research, which is in some ways probably very painful, very hard to do, how do you balance that out and you can look at this from a scholarly kind of intellectual vantage point, but there has to be some way that you balance this, in terms of, because of the subject matter.
It's a difficult topic. I'll just tell you I'm Jewish, and so most of my family in Europe was wiped out in the Holocaust. So that's part of how I was raised. But I was also raised in Indian country. My father was a therapist working with the Kuruk people in Northern California. And the engagement that I have with Native communities is what keeps me going, because it's vividly clear to me every morning when I get out of bed to start the work that it's so important and it has to be done. Historical veracity demands that we tell the truth, and not just as a scholar, but as a human being. We can't let the perpetrators get away with this. They and their allies did an excellent job of making sure that nobody was punished, and then even though it's in the newspapers and in all the documents, we don't talk about it. The only time in California when the state mandates that our young people learn about California Indians is in the 4th grade. I have a 4th grader right now. She can't learn about this. So instead of really talking about Indians, our youth in 4th grade are building little missions out of sugar cubes. They're trying to sweeten genocide with sugar cubes. So I feel really energized all the time to do this, but I also think that if you think about the rupture of losing a loved one for you personally, and then you start to think about the rupture of losing 80% of your community, and imagine if just your community of this class, if everybody's dead except the people in the last 2 rows, or just the last row. That's a heavy thing to contemplate. And you'd want to try, if you're a survivor, to dignify the people in this class that you knew before they died and tell their story. Especially if there are some other people who don't want that story to be told. They want to suppress that story. It's easy to feel energized even after you spend a day crying in the archives. It's kind of an emotional answer, but that's my answer. That's the truth.